Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Party series in Illinois. I am your host, David Rych, with my co-host, Calvin Tomashko. Calvin, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Happy to be here, and I'm so excited to get to do an interview tonight.
Yeah, this is really cool stuff here. Thank you for coming on, Dr. Charla Burnett. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very, very well. Thank you. Very excited to have you on the show. You are just a wealth. You're a library, two libraries filled of information that's valuable and useful to people in the public that need to have probably a greater awareness of what's going on. So let's start with you just giving us a quick description of your bio, kind of get us up to date here, why we asked you to come on the show to talk about your experiences in Palestine.
Yeah, so as I was telling you, I was born and raised here in Lansing, Michigan. I came from a kind of rural, poor community and was able to go to college, be the first person in my family to do so. And I really wanted a non-traditional path, and I wanted to focus on refugees because Lansing, Michigan is a relocation site for refugees. And obviously, growing up in the 21st century, I've seen a lot of xenophobia going on and kind of wondered, like, why? So I started teaching English at the Refugee Development Center here in Lansing while I was attending Michigan State University for a degree in global studies. From there, I studied abroad in France for a year and a half, where I learned French and was given the opportunity to meet many different cultures that I would not have otherwise in Midwestern America. And so I decided to go to the School of International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont, which is an affiliate of World Learning and the Peace Corps. My idea was to go join the Peace Corps, and I was accepted and was offered a position in Cameroon. But during my practicum, I was also offered a year-long internship with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Palestine, where I lived there for a year during the Gaza war. And then I also conducted some research in Liberia and West Africa until Ebola struck. So it seems like everywhere I go, I just come, three days too early or too late. Depends on how you're looking at it. And from there, I was offered a full-ride scholarship to do my PhD in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I decided to specialize in conflict resolution and the use of geospatial technologies. And since then, I have moved back to Lansing, Michigan, where I opened a consultancy that specifically focuses on hyper community development and building organizational capacity for nonprofits, small businesses, and municipal and state governments. And our whole focus is to only commit to projects that are within our own communities so that we have stake in the game. And it reduces kind of that colonialist mindset where we're outsiders coming in to tell somebody what to do. And then we're focused on keeping the money and the funds within the community because we're not contributing to brain drain by taking it away with us when we leave.
Oh, wow. Very cool. So for all you listening, if you ever say, you're bored because you can't find anything to do, I don't want to hear it. That's very impressive. Calvin, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. Let's go right into it. You mentioned experience during the time of the Gaza war. Let's start there. Can you explain what that conflict was?
Yeah. So obviously the history of the conflict predates World War II. But a lot of historians usually place themselves within the contemporary history since 1947 when there was a mass migration of Jews escaping Europe during the Holocaust.
Right.
And during this time, actually, not many people know, but the British were trying to colonize the Middle East and were trying to race France and Germany and other European colonialist countries to gaining control over Africa and the rest of the Middle East. So at that time, Britain actually considered the territory of Palestine their own territory. In actuality, Palestine had its own rich history. That's almost every large kingdom throughout time has at one point claimed Palestine, but no one has been able to hold on to it and maintain it in that way. And so at one point, Britain actually said, okay, no more Jewish people to Israel. And at that time, the Jewish people in Palestine decided to revolt against against them. And it started to become a conflictual relationship, even though it was told that Britain would be giving Palestine over to the Israelites and they would be able to create their own state. At the same time, the Palestinian had its own mostly tribal leaders and own kingdom who was consulted during this process but refused to meet because obviously they weren't going to meet with people who are trying to colonize their land. At this time, the Balfour Declaration was given and handed over, and Israel was formed as the only homeland for Jewish people around the world as a means to protect themselves from a long history of trauma, transgenerational violence that was occurred against xenophobia towards Jewish people. So to me, if anybody's going to really blame anybody for the conflict, it's probably the colonialist powers who forcefully divided the people living there and then pulled out without actually managing the conflict correctly and making sure that there was an actual resolution to that issue. But during the time when they just left and pulled out, it allowed a vacuum of violence to happen. And so the Israelis started going to very poor, mostly rural Palestinian communities and removing them from the land systematically. So you have a mass exodus of Palestine, where roughly between 300 to 700,000 people, these claims are all disputed between who you're asking at the time. But it was quite a large amount of people when you think about it. I think there's only 14 million now today living in Israel. And so I think I read somewhere it's about like 20% of the population of Illinois. I looked it up before because I was interested in trying to like really show you on scale about that. Now that's grown to almost 9 million Palestinian refugees, and they don't just live in the West Bank. They live in all of the surrounding countries, including Egypt and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. And unfortunately, lots of the people in the region got divided during that time. So there were affluent Palestinians who had money, who could pay off the Israelis. They had familiar ties because they had married into Jewish families. Sometimes they themselves might have had Jewish lineage. So in present day, there are actually Palestinians who live as Israelis and who have Israeli passports, who have the flexibility of leaving the country, while the poor, what was termed at the time peasant communities who were removed, were seen as kind of not standing up for Palestine and were then discriminated on. So when you look at statistics today, the overall unemployment rate in the West Bank is much higher than Israel or Palestine, or for Palestinians living abroad. And that's because they're kind of seen as being the cause because they didn't stand and fight for Palestine. And so obviously over time, this escalated tensions as more Jewish people began encroaching on Palestinian land. You have numerous occasions, the 1967 war also, where the surrounding states who had then had mass migration pushed to them wanted to fight back and push the Palestinians back in the middle. And so they also tried to take them, but Israel was able to fight them off because they have enormous financial and political backing by Europe and the United States, which is all a part of, you know, post-communist regimes trying to fight off Russia in the area. They want to make sure that America and Europe has a strong presence in the Middle East, and for them, for a long time, that's been Israel. Now, over the years, Israel has actually shown to have fabricated evidence lots of times to get us involved in wars in the Middle East that really we kind of had no business being in. They've continuously, put PACs forward in the United States legislation for us to give them more money. So now they've built up our arms to a point where Palestinians cannot fight back. And in the West Bank, since the first Intifada, which means uprising, the amount of water that people are able to gain access to is about 70% what the normal person should have in a day. They don't have access to safe sanitation on a day-to-day basis. There's settler violence. So the settlers that have moved into Palestine, which in the West Bank, there are now 300,000, and on occasions will steal their sheep. They'll burn down their olive trees. They'll burn down their houses. We also have situations. So when I was there, I can only speak to what I've personally seen. But I was working in all 19 refugee camps in the West Bank. And I watched as the Israeli Defense Force came and sprayed sewage in one of the refugee camps on people's houses and through their windows.
Oh, my God.
For no other reason than these people were just wanting to leave this space, because technically, if you're in Palestine, you are in a gated community at all times. You can't leave. And a lot of them
leave?
You can't leave. Like if you wanted to leave in the West Bank and you didn't have documentation because your parents' home was taken and everything was destroyed, you might still not have your passport because you might have been living, in a community that's not Ramallah or one of the bigger cities. And so if you wanted to leave to go to Canada, they wouldn't let you leave.
Holy cats. Is the West Bank, does the Israeli government run the whole area?
So yes, everything is monitored and tracked not only by physical force. So in Israel, everyone has mandatory service except Palestinian Israelis and ultra-conservative Haredi Jewish people, because they are pacifists and refuse to.
The kibbutz,
Yeah, they refuse to join. Actually, people in the kibbutz are not necessarily pacifists. A lot of them still serve in the Israeli Defense Force.
I thought that was the whole point, but okay.
Yeah, actually. The ones you see in New York with the big hats and the ringlets, those are the ones who don't serve.
Gotcha.
Ones that you see covering their head, like more Sephardic or also ultra-Orthodox, they still serve. And a lot of times they're actually ultra-conservative and are settlers. So you have a lot of people who are opening kibbutz in Palestinian land. And I've been to lots of the kibbutz. I learned a lot of sustainability practices in deserts from people who run kibbutz. And I really idealize a lot of their values, but there's a lot of cognitive dissonance involved. I think I was actually married to an Israeli for a while. And one thing that they had explained to me was just this deep trauma that they have because of the Holocaust and things that had occurred during a similar massacre that was in Russia. And so they have to fight, because if they don't fight, they will die. And so you have this level of fear and this level of cognitive dissonance where they can just pretend that something's not happening.
Right.
Or I would come to dinner and his family would be like, "Oh, how was your day?" And I would tell them, about perhaps the waste that was, sprayed on people's houses. And they were like, "Oh, you must have misunderstood." I was like, "No, I didn't misunderstand."
Right. No, that sounds like a lot of people in this country.
Yes.
But he didn't kill the black guy.
But a few days after I had arrived, my first time in the Middle East, 3 boys' bodies were found in the West Bank. They were killed by members who were saying that they represented Hamas. And then the Gaza war started, and it was about 37 days of active bombing. Yeah. And then I would say, I don't think attacks by settlers or attacks by Palestinians stopped occurring the entire year that I was there.
Wow. That's got to be terrifying.
Yeah, it was, and I don't think I really understood the full effects of it until I left. And I was diagnosed with PTSD and my hair fell out.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I thought something was wrong with me, like physically, and I was like, "Why is my hair falling out?" But stress does things to your body, and until you're in a safe space. Stress
is really awful. Real quick, and then Calvin, you can take the baton if you don't mind. Can Palestinians vote?
So their vote is limited. They have a parliament, and so they're limited by the percentage in which they can participate in parliament, to the point that their votes do not necessarily count.
Okay. Can they run for office?
specific Israeli Palestinians, yes.
Not the people in the West Bank.
Not the people in the West Bank. They have their own government, which is the Palestinian Authority. And there has been accusations by many Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority were planted by Israeli-American interference of some sort, because the Palestinian Authority gets lots of money to aid in the development of Palestine and has yet to deliver that for its people. It also, you're very likely to be kidnapped or executed or jailed by the Palestinian Authority just as much as you are by the Israeli Defense Force for a lot of Palestinians. And so they're really stuck in a really hard place where they can't trust on their own government to do what's best for them, and also can't trust Israel, obviously, to do anything in their favor either.
Right. Okay. Calvin?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those excellent details and for the information and the wild ride that it puts everyone through, just to hear such awful things going on. I guess there's three areas I want to look at, and I think they're intersectional. I think they're respectful, but please correct me if they're not. I'm looking at the similarities that the U.S. indigenous people face and how they have been displaced. Their treaty land has been consistently diminished, and I've seen maps of Palestinian territory in the area versus U.S. Indigenous territory, and you see both maps shrink over time. I'm also thinking about like how it's similar to the Black community in the U.S. And how they face systemic racism, they face overt racism, and then the last area I want to think about is the kind of leftist thought, the working class solidarity with the Palestinians, and how they are I'm going to bounce this off you. They're a divided group in terms of like the systems there are trying to keep them divided. There's West Bank, Gaza, and the am I saying it right? Diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And that's does that include the Palestinian people who live in Israel state land as well as refugees?
It's kind of a mixed bag because
Okay.
some of the Palestinians in Israel kind of wish that they could do away with their Palestinian identity in some aspects and would like to embrace what would a lot of people call a more Western culture.
Mm-hmm.
But usually when they refer to the diaspora, they're talking about the 5 million Palestinian refugees who live outside of Palestine, the old former Palestine. And they live across the globe in almost every country around the world.
Okay. Well, the parts of the groups that would sympathize with the other Palestinian, I don't know what to call them, encampments or refugee areas. They all came together recently, and you weren't there for this. You've been back since then. But they came together for a general strike, and they didn't show up to work. I know it lasted a couple of days, I believe, and it had some decent effects, and it was good to see that they could all come together despite being in separate areas and struggling to communicate and dealing with the oppression that is going on there. So I think that's really cool. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of those cultural like intersections or those resemblance to the oppression and the struggle that many communities face here in the U.S. and how we can use that to relate to the situation over there.
Yeah, so there are so many parallels between what's currently happening to Indigenous Americans and to our Black population. I think I don't know much about the demands of the strike. One thing to know is it's very complicated. So the United Nations is a foreign entity that helps to run essential services to Palestinians. So that includes education and health and sewerage and trash collection. But the camps themselves are actually ran by camp leadership, which is selected by the camp. Usually some of the camps are corrupt, just like any form of governance, they can be corrupted. And usually these leaders in some way stem back to some sort of clanship that's historical. And so their family have been leaders in these regions and these areas for a long time. So when they go on strike, technically they're usually employees either of the Palestinian Authority or they're employees of the United Nations. And so the United Nations Relief and Works Agency has been functioning at 1/3 of a budget that they are supposed to be functioning at for almost a decade and a half. So when you think about the conditions in which Palestinians already have to work in, let alone the occupation, it's not very good. Hospitals are very worn down. The sanitation foremen have very little resources to be able to use, pick up and manage water resources and trash collection. So it's understandable why they strike, but oftentimes they're striking for reasons that are not always apparent or there's a lot of other caveats involved. So for instance, when I was living there, they were threatening to go on strike because we were trying to oust a director who had sexually assaulted someone. And because they had strong ties with the leadership at all of the camps and had this kind of historical and familiar ties to people in power, was able to do that. And when they strike, it cost the United Nations $21 million a day. So you'll hear such a mixed response from people and where they are in the conflict and what they think about these types of strikes. You'll have Palestinians who think that it's amazing and this is what they should be doing. You'll have Palestinians who are like, no, this is horrible. They're harming us. Like, why would you harm your own people? And you hear this kind of dynamic a lot, and especially in regards to talking about the Palestinian Authority. And I think this kind of goes back to some of the ways in which people in power can destabilize certain environments for their benefit. So I'm not really sure if you know this, but we actually send American police to train with the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli police on tactics. So Palestine really is a battleground for a lot of our military tech. So in the West Bank, there are floating balloons with cameras everywhere as they monitor the whereabouts of everything that's happening. They have some sort of deal with Google. You can't use GPS to go down Palestinian roads. They all take you to the settlement, which is what got me involved in GIS technologies, was the fact that it was actually dangerous for me to use GPS and dangerous for my Palestinian colleagues, because if you used it, it would take you to a settlement, and settlers usually meet you with violence. So you have essentially a controlled environment in which the people who are in power can instigate friction between different groups by implanting specific ideas or imagined stories. So technically, I look at everything that comes out of Palestine with great skepticism. So we might think here in the United States that this is a great union strike, but actually what's happening on the ground could be much different. So I always just try to forewarn people about making assumptions, and even in what seems to be very left and practical and ideal might sometimes be very dark and not actually benefit the people that we want. So going back to Indigenous people, I had an opportunity of traveling out west, and I work with several organizations that are working to preserve Indigenous culture, such as the Sovereign Bodies Institute. There's a number of individuals working for digital democracy and for Sea Sketch who are mapping out coastal regions. And their whole goal is to make sure that we document and preserve land value systems, including Indigenous knowledge and traditional culture, but also getting into the nitty-gritty detail of how much water do we have in these spaces, how much different minerals and things will eventually be extracted from those, whether and so all of that information is very concerning, because when we also preserve that information, that can fall into the wrong hands. And so the tactics of kind of placing people in activist circles to destabilize the movement has happened, and we can see that it happened during water protection. There was a lot of misinformation that was spread around to try to get groups to point fingers at each other instead of coming together and focusing on what was really important.
Yeah.
I think that the tactics that are being shown to police and to our government that are being used in Israel are the same things that are being used on our indigenous communities and Black communities in primarily urban spaces. And so I think what's difficult particularly is the amount of resources that those in power have and how little resources we have. And so that's why to create ways of communication, encrypted data transfer is incredibly important moving forward, and communicating digital and technology literacy to indigenous communities, Black communities, and other activists is going to be incredibly important moving forward so that we can control the narrative.
Yeah, that would have been incredibly useful to the Black Panthers because they were being infiltrated, and the CIA was doing, and the FBI were doing all they could to break up those activist organizations. So, yeah, it's a really good point about how kind of technology and tech literacy is going to help the people on the ground in these organizations, because you do need to hold your cards close to your chest in order to pull this off when you have people trying to actively infiltrate. That's really good stuff. Thank you.
Going back to the Palestinian Authority, the government of the Palestinians, what sort of judicial system do they have? Do they have their own, or do they have to answer to Israel? Do they have their own police departments and that kind of thing, or do they have their own jails and prisons, and do they arrest their own people and that's it? Can they arrest an Israeli if an Israeli comes over and he's being belligerent or something, or no good?
I have never heard of an Israeli being imprisoned in the West Bank, and I think that would result in mass violence.
Okay.
They do have their own judicial system. I do believe that it's based off of a traditional Arabic legal structure, which their legal structure predates ours in Europe and America. It's very sophisticated. They do things, though, such as honor killings are legal.
What?
Honor killings, the killing
I know what they are.
Of women
I heard you.
And there are a number of executions. I think in 2014 there were 9. The year that I lived there, by the Palestinian were allowed by the Palestinian Authority.
Oh my God. Okay.
So there, and that goes back to, again, a lack of gender clarity, the inability for women to be able to demand equal say in a conflict context, because how do you feel about yelling me in a room that's on fire? And so most women don't want to talk about their rights. They want to talk about the rights of their husbands and of their sons, who need to travel across different cities, who are stopped every day and harassed and jailed by the IDF. So in the region, the government still does not hold gender equality to very high standards. And so there's still a lot of criticism, and this allows a lot of criticism by Israel and Israelis to say, oh, well, look at what they're doing. They're not this, they're not their, whatever ideal that Israel has as a democracy. Because as we know, Bibi was just, stealing from everybody and had a $3,000, $5,000 a year ice cream budget.
Who did?
Bibi Netanyahu.
Oh, yeah. That guy.
Yeah, very corrupt, very
Extremely,
undemocratic government in Israel, regardless of them claiming to be the only democracy in the Middle East. And so, there's still problems in their judicial system and the way things are working. But they do have their own jails. They do have their own police. They jail people quite frequently for different types of disturbances.
Okay. Calvin? Yeah, I want to hear more about some of the solutions that you and your crews are working on, and some of your activist assistance, where there's mapping and there's communication guidelines, and there's I'm trying to think programs like Organized Together. I've listened to a podcast that you were on, and you mentioned that. So tell us about some of these technologies and maybe explain what GSI is, because I like looked it up and watched a few videos and I still don't quite grasp it. So I think people would be interested in that.
So again, I became interested in cartography, which is what map making is. I'm not a geographer. I wish I could go back in time and go through and do a human geography degree, but I can't do that now. But
no,
the thing
not till time travel.
is when I was in the West Bank, I had to go back in with hand maps and try to figure out, how to get from one point to point B. And there's like a good 5-6 hour drive from the north to the south. So there's lots of places to get lost. Had to learn my directional Arabic very quickly. But I couldn't imagine how it must be for a non-literate woman with children whose husband has been taken by the IDF and has been out of your home for a month to go and find social services on their own. And so we were working with a department of geographers at UNRWA. My Palestinian engineers were an amazing team who were able to create all of the maps of all of our service programs, all of the educational areas. I was also able to work with all of the sanitation foremen in all 19 camps in the West Bank and create mapping systems so that they could kind of laminate the maps and write in whose responsibility it was to pick up the trash in X spaces. And so that's kind of how it started. And then I came across something called counter mapping. And I was like, ooh, what is this? And essentially what it is it's mapping against oppressive regimes, oppressive powers. And so there's all these different ways in which obviously you can apply this, but one that I really liked was the harass map in Egypt. So they've been notoriously corrupt police. If you're a woman and you get sexually assaulted, or if you're raped, a lot of times you're not helped by the police there. So some activists kind of took it into their own hands to start mapping where all the different harassment occurred in all of the neighborhoods, and then would create public policy around those maps to increase enforcement in certain areas, social services in other areas. And so they now take that to Cairo and kind of demonstrate, here's the issue areas, here's where we need more cultural awareness and programming for men so that they respect women more. And so that's one way it can be used. We have other ways that my colleagues are using it. We co-founded the International Society of Participatory Mapping, and a lot of them are working with indigenous communities all over the globe. But one of them specifically was mapping cultural knowledge and different assets in the Amazon. Right now, there are roughly 300 environmentalists that go missing just out of Latin America alone each year. So it's extraordinarily dangerous to be advocating environmental awareness or protections against extractive industries. And so they've really had to dig deeper into how do we tell these stories and preserve our environment without giving up too much information about that environment so that it draws kind of foreign interests in the resources that they have there, and then how can they use that with the help of the United Nations to preserve and make these areas World Heritage Sites. And so they were working on that. There's been mapping initiatives where I've worked to create volunteer geographic systems information. So GIS, Geographic Information Systems, is essentially what the tools that you use to collect, manage, and analyze spatial information. So essentially, you just take the coordinates of a system, so let's say Lansing, Michigan, and you attach some sort of descriptive information to that point on the map. And then you can take all of the points and analyze patterns between them. So for instance, in the for-profit industry, they use what we do to calculate the expected expected sales of Christmas of all of the stores by counting how many cars are in the parking lot over a certain period of days. They can actually predict how many sales they're going to do during like Black Friday.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I can use that same information to say prove that there's been gentrification in certain areas over others. I used it to identify counties in Michigan where doctors were over prescribing opiate medication over the mean.
Wow.
so that we can go to those counties and talk to the doctors and do something that we call educational detailing, which we teach them about the negative impacts that they could be having. And then we also document and send it to the federal government so that they can keep tracking and tabs on those doctors to make sure that they're not overprescribing medication. So there's lots of different ways that we can use maps to help support kind of activist and community-based objectives and goals.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay, so I don't want to. Sorry.
Randomly speechless.
Yeah,
I'm
totally.
blown away.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Our minds are blown. And seriously, very interesting stuff here. Is this that's an organization that you started, or you were involved in?
I started it with Rudo Kemper, and it was kind of the. So there's a lot of times difficulty between scholars and practitioners, and I'm sure in any activist communities, they will tell you the same. We have scholars who are very intelligent. They might be technical experts in some specific field, but they come with their own objectives into the activist community and try to force methods to try to, extract some sort of data, but it also trying to help the community achieve some sort of goal as well. But in international development, based off of all of the horrible things we've done throughout time in international development, we've realized the only way to sustainably help develop a community is if they're participating in the methods to develop them. Oh my gosh, who would have thought, right? Who would have thought?
Yeah.
The thing is that we often say, okay, it's good for them over there in those countries, but that type of development methodology isn't good here in America. We do things by capitalist standards, and it's all about the bottom line, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
And so for us at ISPM, it's a global organization, particularly focused on providing technical capacity building or technology directly to underrepresented communities, particularly from the global South, but also from within the global North as well, particularly around, those who are underserved. So in rural America, or Black and Indigenous communities or immigrant populations as well. So we used GIS. I also helped to found another organization that's embedded at UMass Boston called the Refugee Network. And we use GIS to map all of the migrant services and then figure out where there are gaps or deserts in those types of services. And then we send that information to the mayor's office.
Do you get positive responses from the people that you draw your conclusions and send to?
Oh, yes, just really amazing responses, because I think that the ability to visualize what's actually happening can be such a strong and powerful tool. But I mean, just like any statistics, there are ways to which you can change things so that you actually misinterpret the data. And so I always, this is not, it's a method, it's a tool in which someone can wield, and depending on their intentions is the result.
Right, they could be villainous or they could be righteous, one or the other.
Right, like wielding a sword.
Exactly. So with all your education, are you trained in the sciences and statistics and mathematics?
Yeah, so
that was a part of it. Yeah.
During my PhD, I did a full year econometrics and then a full year of GIS. But I'm formally trained in community mediation and participatory development. So I was really able to merge those things. And when I started going to GIS conferences, I found them to be very physical science based, very white and male. Very not really concerned about participation. Like when I asked how many women participated in this GIS community development project in the Caribbean, and they would be like, oh, well, we didn't include any women. And I'm like, oh, well.
They just forgot, or they just specifically didn't do it on purpose?
They just forgot.
So do you know the great book series? No, anyway, okay. The same thing happened. It's like it's this huge series of books of like the greatest intellects of all time, not one woman. And he was just at the end of it, he's like, oops. Just crazy. Oh yeah, them.
So Rudo Kemper, who helped to co-found the organization, is from the Amazon. And he kind of went to Greg Brown, who passed away several years ago, but he started the Center for Landscape Values at Cal Poly. And he said, this is the first international conference in participatory mapping. And we kind of went to him with our complaints that this is a space that doesn't really feel practitioner based. It doesn't feel very easily accessible to Indigenous populations. I don't see a lot of women here, and the women who are here are dedicated to like quantitative analysis. There's no, there are not very many anthropologists or sociologists or linguists, which is really important for communication.
Sure.
And we really need all of these different skill sets to really develop these tools. And so my academic career is dedicated to how do we build software that can communicate big analytical problems and analyses in a way that people can understand and also feel empowered to act. So I've been spending the last 5 years just trying every software system we possibly can, which is why Springer asked me to do an edited volume on this. So I'm working with 27 other practitioners and developers to evaluate these tools, because there's at least a dozen that are used worldwide by a lot of people. But it's not easy to know why you would use one over the other. That took me literally, I feel like, just a couple of years ago, maybe to finally feel like I grasped this topic enough to figure out and choose a software system. And so International Society of Participatory Mapping is really kind of our spite child, because Greg Brown looked at us and was like, well, I'll give you the money if you do it. As if we weren't really going to go and take this money to start this organization. And he wanted us to kind of prove his colleagues wrong, because this conversation has been happening for decades in rural appraisal and ecosystem services. We know that Indigenous people are supposed to be involved, but how do we involve them in the discussion here with us? And so we're a 100% digital space. We run on Mighty Networks, which is also what we host Organizing Together on as well. It's an online learning management platform. And so we come together to do webinars on specific topics of participatory mapping. We run a journal, and we kind of keep posting in a living library of all the different case studies we come across in participatory mapping, since it's such a broad space.
Yeah. Calvin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know, like, if you were to try to have some participatory mapping going on in Palestine right now, or another region, and we as Americans are part of a colonizer state. We're still, like, examples like Puerto Rico. We're still like taking resources and not treating a whole land and its people correctly. We're also capitalist, so we're always looking for some sort of revenue stream, and our main goals are profit. So how on earth could you have a foreign group view you as somebody worthy of trust and to deploy and give information about a region? How do you begin that relationship?
That's a really good question, and let me make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So you're interested in if I per se was a facilitator of participatory mapping, how would I engage the local population and kind of moving forward with a process like this? Mm-hmm. Well, for one, I don't get to choose the process, so it might not be a participatory mapping that the community decides. So we start with something called participatory action research, where we kind of bring in a group of people. We usually try to make the group look like the demographic makeup of the area as much as possible. And we kind of just start asking questions about what is your problem? Where do these problems occur? Why are these problems occurring? And then we're able to kind of pinpoint a set of problems that the organizations would set to solve. So if I was going to do that, I would look at okay, they have this problem. B, I would go to all of the local organizations already focused on those problems, because guaranteed they have a rich history and knowledge of what tactics have worked in the past and which ones need to be implemented in the future. I can then, as a facilitator, list a set of probably 20 methods, why they're used, And I would suggest to them, what I think if they're interested in knowing, but essentially it's up to them. And my goal as the facilitator is either A, to teach them how to do it and let them do it themselves because they need to be the masters of their own destiny, or two, they can ask for my help and I can help facilitate it. But it has to be a community-wanted, community-led, and a community-implemented project, or it simply isn't sustainable in the long run.
Excellent. Yeah.
So does the UN employ you?
Currently not at this moment. I work under the capacity of doing map making for specific sections and ambassadors. I work with a lot of stateless people and stateless nations to kind of advise them on how they can collect geographic information that can help them make a case at the International Criminal Court or for land tenure at the General Assembly and Security Council.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, because this sounds like something that would be right up the UN's alley. They would probably highly covet this sort of information and activity.
Yeah, they do.
What they do. So you mentioned before about sustainability and ecosystems and that kind of thing. So how do you use the GIS or this organization this is a Green Party show to help the environment in whatever way?
So I was a fellow at C-Sketch, which is at the Center of Marine Science at UC Santa Barbara. And C-Sketch is a web-based software service that helps communities map ecosystems in marine environments with the hopes of creating marine protection zones, which help to facilitate the replenishment of at-risk populations that are either being polluted to death or overfished. So part of what I did is I went with the Wade Institute down to the Caribbean and Barbuda, what was going to be Montserrat and Curacao, but the Hurricane Irma hit, and unfortunately we had to cut the research in half, and so I mostly just stayed in Barbuda. And I evaluated a initiative called Blue Halo that worked with the local fishermen to map out all of the different types of species. They brought in environmental scientists who confirmed that those species lived there and the state of their habitat, ranking the habitat and which ones were most at risk down to, being good. And then they place these maps over one another, so they're layered. And they can see across different people's uses and objectives and how they want it to be seen as, okay, these are areas of commonality. So we can talk about these areas, agree on them, and move to ones that have more disputes. And so you can get 20 layers and see that in this small section of the marine population on, let's just say, the western coast, in this specific area, they fish, they do lobster there. And they need to make sure that they replenish it for the next season. And we know that X amount of people use it for fishing here, but not over here. They could move the population so that they're only fishing in these areas until that population has regained in numbers. And so they were able to successfully create marine protection zones around Barbuda, which is a very small island. It's one of the last communal land systems in the world. Everyone there gets land for their house, their cattle, and their crops. And so it was really nice to work with a really small localized community. They only have about 2,000 people living on the island. But what was interesting that was happening is during Hurricane Irma, they had kicked everyone off of the island 4 days later and didn't let them back on for a year. Ooh. And while they were doing that, they let Hewlett Packard and Robert De Niro start building an international airport. And when I arrived, there was only about, I would say, 30 or 40 people living there because the others weren't allowed back on the island. They had somewhere snuck over there. And Robert De Niro was actually living on the island.
The actor?
Yes.
What does he have to do with an international airport?
He was trying to buy the land that's unbuyable to build an international airport because him and Hewlett Packard had bought Princess Diana Beach, which used to be Princess Diana's favorite place to go vacation, and were building their own private kind of hotel and vacation spot.
Yeah, capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah, capitalism. And so when I arrived, it was just coming to light that they had already wiped out the most important mangroves and ecosystem on the island. And the blacktop was already laid. And then as soon as the Barbudan Council was told about it, they let Antigua, which is their twin island, because they are still a territory of Great Britain. They have one seat in Parliament that they share. And oftentimes Bermuda, because they refuse to privatize the land, is kind of bullied by Antigua to privatize. And so all the aid from Irma never got sent to the island because the prime minister of Antigua was trying to force them to buy their land for $1 so that they would have to start paying private property taxes and sell their property.
It's so ridiculous. My God.
So they filed an injunction at the International Caribbean Court of Justice that put a halt on the initiative. But then by the time they had all the environmentalists come in, they had already did so much damage, they just let him complete the project anyways. And now there's a hotel there that Robert De Niro owns with. I think Packer pulled out because he died and his children took over and didn't want to do it anymore.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. Things you don't know about our celebrities.
Yeah. That kind of leads into my next question and thought. And that is...
Leonardo DiCaprio has his own private space in Belize, and he doesn't allow anyone to come on it. And it's like a huge gated community. And I've heard he's a jerk to everyone.
I thought he was Mr. Environmentalist.
I know, right? I was really disheartened because I went to Belize to visit a friend, and that's when I heard about all of the McAfee situation.
Oh, yeah.
If you guys heard about John McAfee.
No, I know about it.
So my friend lives in the same city as John McAfee, and we were driving, we were talking about it. We met all the locals and heard all of their stories. And then he's like, oh, well, have you heard about Leonardo DiCaprio? So he had to drive me past his property. And so the locals didn't have anything nice to say about him either, unfortunately.
Yeah, causes not candidates is a phrase. And there's other phrases like it that just mean like stand for the principles, don't necessarily have heroes, because sometimes heroes can let you down, like Leo. Thanks, Leo. I wanted to ask about the democratization that happens with some of this tech and how that's a beautiful thing. And then I want to spin it into something. You don't have to go there with me, but I want to spin it into democratic socialism. To some is an oxymoron because it's democratizing the means of production. It's democratizing the workplace, for example. So I see democratization in tech as being a beautiful thing leading towards the democratization of economies and societies. And I'd love to see a more socialist movement. I know, to bring it back to Palestine, there is a socialist movement happening there. It may not be fully formed and it may have negative caveats like you've mentioned very wisely. But what do you think about this democratization in tech and where that's going? Is it a good thing? Are there pitfalls to look out for? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so participatory mapping, since it's really an idealistic kind of theory of how we can empower marginalized communities through the power of mapping. The majority of the software companies outside of Ezra, which you might have heard of ArcGIS, they're kind of the big capitalist tech lead for GIS and for geospatial computing. But there are a number of open source software, including Ushahidi, Mapio, and many, many others. C-Sketch will soon be open source as well. And I would say that that's the only way that we can move forward in making sure that everyone has access, equal access. It's only one step in that process, of course, but it is the first step because a lot of times, and I deal with this a lot, so through Organizing Together, one of our main components of organizational development is technology literacy. And I try to help nonprofits and small businesses and governments find tech solutions that are free and open source. So I spent a lot of time searching for these tools, thinking about these tools. And I would say, like I said, it's one step in democratizing and ensuring that everyone has equal access. Now, there are, of course, pitfalls to this. And one of them is, how do these companies stay in business if they're not making money off of their software? And this has been really hard for me and developers like me, because I also code and I developed to help create some of this GIS technology, is how do we how do we create a sustainable revenue pathway if we're giving out, what we're doing for free? And I think that that's a lot of really well-intentioned organizations are really struggling with. The second part is when you have something that's open source, anyone can download the code. Anyone can use it and put it up and say it's secure, but if they don't know what they're doing, it might not be. So you really have to make sure that the people who are operating it, particularly when you're collecting sensitive data, that they really know what they're doing. And I'm afraid that particularly in activist and nonprofit circles where we don't have a whole lot of money or resources to be working with, we often cut corners. And sometimes that can be to the detriment of our communities.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We only got about 5 minutes left. So going back to the how you use GIS for environmental stuff, in your expert opinion, how much time do you think we have? Like 7, 8 years it's over?
It was over in 2016.
Okay, that's what I thought.
They told you that. I think they've been telling us that since like 1972.
Yeah, but some of the models haven't been really good at predictions, and so people use that against modeling.
I think humans are an enigma and that we will survive and survive no matter what. But I think that we need to start, instead of talking about climate, stopping climate change, we need to be talking about management, because it's here, it's happening. We're literally actively going through it. And you can see, especially I feel like in this last couple of years, we've had mass fires worldwide, swarms of locusts. What's this about? And mass flooding that has now
droughts, record-breaking temperatures. It just goes up and up every year. It's even Biden said, and I'm not a huge fan of Biden, but he even said, he's like, it was 116 degrees in Portland, Oregon. What do you think made that happen? That's never ever happened before, kind of thing. I mean, it's just ridiculous. All over the places. There's a huge water shortage out west, and so the federal government is actually cutting off X amount of water to the southwest, like in Arizona and stuff, over the next year. So farmers are going to be allocated less water.
Cannabis companies are given an outlet where they don't have to follow those same rules. And so right now, we advocate for the legalization of cannabis and decriminalization of substances as a mental health issue. But now we're fighting the cannabis companies because they're taking all the water.
That's interesting. Don't make pot illegal again, though. That would upset me.
Yeah, I know. But we also can't take all the water from indigenous communities.
Yeah, I know.
Say we're just free, pot smoking hippies. That's the worst kind of hippie.
I wanted to highlight real quick that the fires, the wildfires, some people have gotten that to the point where, that's normalized. It's expected. Maybe even some are thinking, these are just healthy, regular burns. They might be healthy on some level, but if you look at the maps, and hopefully later on I'll put a link in the description for this video, but the maps of these wildfires, these are massive. These are the biggest they've ever been. They're hitting every continent. It's very startling to look at these maps and how much of the forest we've lost to these fires. This is not a healthy burn. This is not normal. Don't normalize this. This is not what should be happening.
We've also never managed our woodlands correctly either, which it contributes to just the mass brush fires that we see that start and are just gone. And it's because we've stopped indigenous communities from practicing the land tenureship that they had been practicing for hundreds of years, which kept these fires controlled. And it was actually the federal system of parks that removed those types of practices from what we're doing today and are causing some of these major fires. So again, it's like looking at traditional knowledge as a means to preserving the environment and to our ecosystems and to fight climate change is really what we should be doing, is empowering those indigenous communities and giving them all the resources they need to teach us.
Absolutely, 100%. Real quick, Jenny Lester said, can you provide a list of currently safe open source software that you have looked at the code?
Mapio is probably the safest software. They've actually created a system where you can transfer data without being online. Also, the data is encrypted. And so it won't look like it's mapping data. when you're transferring it between computers and phones. And you can use your phone, you turn off your data, you walk into the space and you drop all of the points that you would like to on a map. And this is how they do it in the Amazon. And then they walk away, they turn it back on, but that's already been encrypted. It doesn't look like mapping data on your phone.
Mapeo, M-A-P-E-O.
Yep, and it's ran by Embedded at Digital Democracy, which is Rudo Kemper and Ayanna. They're great work. They also do Terra Stories, which focuses specifically on storytelling, oral storytelling in indigenous communities and applying that to maps to preserve their culture.
That's cool.
Oh, that's
well, this is intense. Yeah, this is really well. So unfortunately, the hour's up. Ginny said thank you. Again, I have 8 million more questions for you and so much more to talk about. So we're probably just going to have you back on the show. If that'd be okay. That'd be great. Thank you so much, Dr.
Have a wonderful evening.
Charla Burnett, for coming on the show. Calvin, thank you, sir, for being here.
Yeah, and I want to offer up a chance real quick. Are there any other major organizations or things that you wanted to plug real quick before we head off?
I would just say make sure you check out organizingtogether.org. There's a lot of useful resources there. We also teach courses on participatory mapping, among other organizational development practices. You'll also find the MODA community, the Michigan Overdose Data to Action. So if you are interested in learning how to treat substance abuse, if you have someone who needs support, you can access that all there. It's a space ran by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services in partnership with Wayne State and other universities throughout Michigan.
All right, sounds good. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight to the Illinois Green Party. I'm your host, David Rych, with my co-host, Kelvin Tomashko, and our awesome guest, Dr. Charla Burnett. Thank you again, Charla, for coming on the show. Yeah. Till next time, everybody, be good, be green.